The year is 1530. A Portuguese slave ship anchors off the West African coast. The captain steps ashore, chest heavy with gold, brass, and firearms. He has one mission, not pepper, not ivory, but people. Everywhere along this coastline, the Atlantic slave trade is exploding. Millions are being stolen. Kingdoms are collapsing under the weight of European demand. Entire generations are vanishing across the ocean, never to return. But when this captain walks into the royal court of the Benin Empire, something unexpected happens. The Oba, the king, looks him dead in the eye and delivers an ultimatum. You can buy our pepper, you can buy our ivory, you can buy our cloth, but you will never buy our men. In a world being torn apart by the most destructive economic system in human history, one African kingdom drew a line and held it for over 3 centuries. But the story of how they did it and why is far more complicated, far more human, and far more remarkable than most people have ever been told. When Portuguese traders first reached the Bight of Benin in the late 1400s, they were not entering an empty coast. They were entering a system, a kingdom, a capital. Benin City was one of the most advanced urban centers in the pre-colonial world, described across multiple European accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries as structured, planned, and governed under strict royal administration. Broad, symmetrical avenues, thousands of organized compounds, massive earthwork walls, and defensive ditches stretching further than the eye could see. Some European visitors, accustomed to assuming the worst about what they would find in Africa, compared its orderliness directly to the great cities of their own continent. But Benin was not trying to impress Europe. It was enforcing order for itself. At the center of that order stood one figure, the Oba, not just a king in the political sense, a sacred authority, binding law, religion, trade, and military power into a single unbreakable system. Everything that moved inside Benin's borders moved with the Oba's knowledge. Everything that left Benin's borders left with the Oba's permission. And in the early 1500s, the Oba who would define Benin's relationship with the slave trade was a man named Essajie. He inherited a kingdom under pressure, enemies at the borders, European ships multiplying on the coastline, a new and terrifying global economy reshaping every kingdom it touched. Essajie looked at what the slave trade was doing to his neighbors. The population drain, the political destabilization, the kingdoms hollowed out from within, and he made a calculation, not a moral declaration, a strategic one. Every young man loaded onto a European ship was one less soldier available to defend Benin's borders, one less farmer to feed the kingdom, one less artisan to sustain the royal guilds, one less person accountable to the Oba's authority. Mass export of his own people was not just ethically wrong by Benin standards, it was structurally dangerous. And Essajie treated it as the political risk it was. But Essajie's position was not only military calculation, it was also written into the culture itself, into the very skin of his people. In Benin, identity was not kept in records or registers. It was written on the human face. The system was called Iwu, facial and body markings used among the Edo people of the kingdom, carved into the skin, visible to anyone who looked. These were not decoration. They were not ceremony for its own sake. They were classification. They indicated lineage, clan origin, social belonging, and political identity within the kingdom. In a world without passports, without identification systems, without written census records, your face told your story. And that mattered enormously, because slavery in this era was not based on race in the modern sense. It was based on belonging, war captives, criminals, outsiders from beyond the political community. Those were the people the trade consumed. So, Iwu marks served a function that was both deeply cultural and brutally strategic. If you bore the marks of Benin on your face, you were inside the political body of the Oba. You belonged to something larger than yourself. To enslave you was not merely a crime. It was a direct challenge to the Oba's sacred authority, a declaration of war against the empire itself. European buyers learned this quickly. Purchasing someone bearing Iwu marks had one guaranteed consequence: the full military wrath of the Benin Empire descending upon you. The marks on the skin were, in effect, the most powerful passport in West Africa. Permanent, unforged, impossible to fake. Now here is where the history demands honesty, because the version of this story that travels most easily, the version that feels cleanest and most heroic, is not the complete version. Benin was not a kingdom outside the slave trade entirely. It was an expansionist empire. When its armies conquered neighboring peoples, they took prisoners of war. And for a period in the early 1500s, the kingdom permitted the sale of female captives taken from outside tribes to European traders. The Portuguese saw this and pushed immediately. They begged the Oba to extend the same access to male captives. They arrived at court with crates of advanced European firearms, luxury coral beads, and brass. They offered everything they had. The Oba refused every time. And by the mid-1500s, the Obas who followed Esigi closed even that loophole, placing a total embargo on all human export from Benin ports. What this tells us is important. Benin's position was not moral purity in the modern sense. It was statecraft. The Oba ruled through court officials, bronze-casting guilds, tribute networks, and a sophisticated military structure. Every person within the kingdom's borders was load-bearing infrastructure in that system. Farmers sustained food supply. Warriors defended the borders. Artisans produced the royal prestige objects that announced Benin's power to the world. Mass human export would have dismantled the very architecture of the state. So the Oba protected his people not because he was ahead of his time in his moral thinking. He protected them because he understood power. He understood what his kingdom was built from. And he refused to sell the foundations. That is not a lesser story. That is a more honest one. Frustrated and empty-handed, Portuguese captains eventually stopped arguing. If they wanted to trade in Benin, they traded by Benin's rules: pepper, ivory, cloth, bronze. For human cargo, they sailed further down the coast to smaller kingdoms, weaker states, places that could not push back the way Benin could. And the trade continued its devastation elsewhere. But within Benin's sphere, something different was happening. The kingdom was building. The bronze guilds were producing work of extraordinary sophistication. Detailed plaques recording royal history, ceremonial heads, animal figures of breathtaking precision. European visitors who saw these objects struggled to reconcile what they were looking at with what they had assumed about Africa. The craftsmanship was undeniable. The cultural confidence was unmistakable. Benin was not surviving the era of the slave trade. It was thriving within it, on its own terms. For over 3 centuries that held. Benin's political structure, its military strength, its controlled borders, and its diversified economy kept its heartland relatively insulated from the worst of what was happening across the continent. But the world does not leave strong kingdoms alone forever. By the late 1800s, Britain was not interested in trade partners. It wanted control of rubber, of palm oil, of the entire commercial infrastructure of West Africa. One by one, the kingdoms that had navigated centuries of European pressure were being absorbed into the British Empire by force. Benin refused to surrender. In January 1897, a British diplomatic mission attempted to enter Benin against the Oba's explicit instructions. The mission was ambushed. Several British officials were killed. Whether the ambush was ordered by the Oba or carried out by independent commanders remains contested by historians to this day. It did not matter to London. The response was swift and overwhelming. In February 1897, a British military force of over 1,000 soldiers launched what they called the Punitive Expedition. They moved through Benin's defenses. They entered the city. And within days, the capital that had stood for centuries was burning. The Oba was captured and exiled. The palace was destroyed. And then came the looting. Thousands of bronze plaques, ivory carvings, ceremonial objects, and royal regalia, the accumulated artistic and historical record of a civilization, were removed from the burning city and shipped to Europe, to museums in London, to collections in Berlin, to galleries in Paris. Objects that recorded Benin's kings, its battles, its trade negotiations, its cultural life across centuries. Objects that were, in every meaningful sense, the kingdom's written history, were placed in glass cases on foreign soil and labeled as curiosities. The kingdom that had protected its people from one form of foreign extraction for 300 years was finally broken by another. The irony is almost too heavy to carry.
So what does the Benin Empire actually represent? Not perfection, not myth, not the simple hero story that is easy to tell and easy to share. Something harder and more important than that. Proof that African kingdoms were not passive, not helpless, not waiting to be saved or conquered or written about by outsiders. They were geopolitical actors, making calculated decisions under enormous pressure, with incomplete information, in a world that was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. The Benin Empire navigated the most destructive economic system in human history through military self-interest, cultural identity infrastructure, centralized political control, and the strategic refusal to be fully absorbed by foreign demand. Oba Esigye's position was not just a law. It was a masterclass in what sovereignty actually means. Not the absence of compromise, not moral perfection, but the insistence, sustained, defended, and enforced on deciding for yourself what your people are worth. The next time you see a Benin bronze sitting in a glass case in a Western museum, stop. Look at it properly. You are not looking at art. You are looking at the visual record of an empire that looked at the most destructive economic system in human history and said, "Not on my terms." The past is not simple. It is structured. And Benin was one of its architects. For more African stories like this one, please like and subscribe. And if you like this story, you should see the next one.